You know, the other interesting thing, too, that I've been thinking a lot about when it comes to the Rocky Mountains in particular is it served for a short time anyway as an alternative for people who were disenfranchised in the East. And let me give you three quick examples. One would be the wealthy sons of very prominent men in England and certainly in New York and Boston and up and down the eastern seaboard who didn't buy into the establishment, basically. They were way ahead of their time. They were almost like the rich kids of the 60s wanting to go back to the land. So they left, a lot of times left behind their wealth and never came back and became trappers in the Rocky Mountains, and the literacy rate with trappers was very similar to the nation as a whole. You had people like James Clyman, a very smart guy who used to pontificate in his journals about the nature of the speed of light. Rufus Sage had a postulation that the Romans had come over to the northern plains at least and spread their language, and then he set about comparing Sioux Indian words to Latin and found them to be very, very similar. And then the other disenfranchised group at that same time were black men who had been, many of them, slaves in the East, and they had purchased or escaped slavery, come out to the Rocky Mountains, and were welcomed not only by the other trappers but by the Native Americans, to the extent that some of the Indians would no longer deal with white men after about 10 years of trapping. They would only deal with black men. When it came time to choose a trustworthy guide for the first two white women to cross the Continental Divide into the Walla Walla missions, they picked Black Harris, a former slave who was considered the most trustworthy and skillful of anyone. And then you had Edward Rose up in Montana. He was essentially a co-chief, not calling the shots entirely, but having a lot to say about what happened on 7,000 square miles of land up in what's now Montana. So you had this very disenfranchised group suddenly finding not only acceptance but some level of prominence in the Rockies. And then the third group is these wealthy young women suffragists who in the 1890s and early 1900s came out west and found a kind of freedom and respect for them as people that didn't seem to be existing in their high society life, where they'd go to these summer resorts and have to not sweat and wear certain kinds of clothing. There was something called the language of the fans in the 1880s and 90s, where if you were a young single woman, you were not supposed to engage men directly. You would hold your fan to the right side of your face if it meant yes, and left side if you were saying no. And it was just ridiculous. And they came out to these dude ranches in the Rockies, and these cowboys are saying, "What? This is nuts." So it got so popular that finally the New York Times said, in addition to all these other places that a well-bred young woman needed to experience in the world, she should also spend at least 4 to 6 weeks in a Rocky Mountain dude ranch. And Susan B. Anthony in the 1800s said that she tried to coordinate a big group of suffragists to come out and move to Wyoming Territory, because Wyoming Territory in 1869 had passed a suffrage act and refused to come into the Union unless women were given the right to vote. And that was 50 years before women were given the right to vote. So it was selective, and I don't want to portray the Rockies as the den of equality for everyone, but it was really an outstanding place to not only escape the confines of civilization literally, but to escape those confines of social mores and rigid roles that you were expected to play.
That's amazing. I love that. I was thinking of Jim Beckworth.
Oh,
you're talking
yeah.
about the black, indigenous
right.
black cowboy matrix. He was a wild one, man.
Totally.
The other thing that